Hello everybody, welcome back to our House Call series, From Confusion to Clarity. We're continuing our conversation on ethics. This is part 3. So Barry, from our previous 2 conversations that we had pretty much developed an idea that if society has the right to protect itself and obligate the individual to accept certain risks or harms or limitations to their freedoms, that it must make a pretty damn good moral argument to support that. That cannot be done in a whimsical process, right? That it needs to have a valid justification for doing so, and it must be backed up by reason and evidence.
Yeah, and I think we have to realize that any rule we develop has to have exceptions, just by definition. I mean,
Yes.
it's why when you're accused of a crime, you're allowed to have a lawyer and go to court, because the courts want to figure out the context of the crime that you've been accused of, and you're assumed innocent until proven guilty. And there's always an appeal process with that. And so any rule needs to have exceptions, and we need to incorporate into that rule an appeal process. Because if we don't, what we're really saying is that we don't have compassion. And any time in history when we've lacked compassion, when we've robotically applied a rule, things have generally gone south in a very bad way. I mean, Nuremberg is a good example. I mean, the Nuremberg trials came up because of the horrific abuses during World War II in Nazi Germany. People were literally tortured to death in an agonizing way, often with the oversight or even the assistance of licensed physicians.
You know, Nazi Germany was a deviation from what was considered to be normal, right? And as a reminder to people to understand, it's true that the most atrocious experiments happened to people without their consent, and that constituted crimes against humanity. So I guess the question to ask is it relevant, or is it relevant to our present situation, the Nuremberg Code, to our present situation?
Well, it's quite true, Paula, that Nazi Germany was an aberration or an extreme. There's no doubt about that. But it would be naive of us to believe that North America has not have some blood in its hands in the same respect.
I was just going to ask about North America.
I don't know if you're familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. It was done over the course of a number of decades, from the 30s till the 70s, in which black men who had syphilis were denied treatment with penicillin that was readily available in order for physicians to study the natural history of the progression of untreated syphilis. If you know anything about untreated syphilis, it's nasty. And that occurred in North America, and it ended in the 70s.
It's a 40-year experiment.
That's a long time. And equally, there were physicians who conducted experiments in which they injected cancer cells into elderly people in nursing homes without their knowledge or permission, or the knowledge or permission of their loved ones. And I could go on and on about the kind of things that have happened over the years. So, this experimentation that we do often is justified as increasing our understanding of disease and treatment, etc., etc. But the trouble is, although society will benefit from that knowledge, it often involves us sacrificing in very inhumane ways individuals without their permission. And if there's one lesson I learned when I did my master's degree in bioethics, it's this: good people trying to do good things with the best of intentions can still end up doing very bad things. And at the end of the day, we have to realize that that is always a possibility. And we cannot feel that somehow we're exempt, which is why the Nuremberg Code has been so helpful for us.
It seems to me what happens when you make that statement is there is a complete lack of respect for the individual. So we need to go back to that big time. When I say respect for the individual, it is respect for the right of their privacy, the right to their confidentiality, their right to some level of autonomy in their lives, in control over their children's lives, the right to make decisions about their own lives, how they want to live, the right to different perspectives, values, and worldviews. I think we need to go back to the basics and assume the best of people first, and then we can act with compassion. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize that as much as we want to promote the health and welfare of society, we are crossing a very dangerous threshold when we treat an individual like a thing, like a means to our end. We have to remember that 7 billion people on the planet, they're all going to have different needs and different values. But if we learn to listen to them carefully, almost always we can find some common ground with which to share. And no one, for example, wants to get sick or die. No one wants to see a loved one get sick or die. Mm-hmm. And so at the end of the day, we have to realize that every measure that we undertake during the pandemic, however, has a risk of making things worse. So as much as we don't want to get sick and die, things we do to prevent that can actually do harm. And we have to find a way to balance that. And there will not be any perfect solutions. It's almost always going to involve a trade-off of one type or another. So a good example would be, as we talked about earlier, we want to protect the elderly in nursing homes, but on the other hand, we don't necessarily want them to die alone, or for other diseases to go untreated, or for their dementia to worsen because they're not getting the kind of contact with their loved ones that they're normally used to. So at the end of the day, ethical decisions are difficult decisions in and of themselves, but particularly difficult because ultimately what we're trying to do is make a decision now about how we think the future is going to unfold. So in many ways, ethics is about predicting the future. And in the words of Yogi Berra, it's difficult making predictions, especially about the future. And although we try to make the best decisions we can, we often realize that we can't be paralyzed by the fact that we don't know it's a perfect decision or the perfectly right decision. And we have to proceed regardless. And that sense of unsureness about whether we've made the right decision is referred to as moral residue. That sense of angst we have that we may have made the wrong decision, but we can't allow that to paralyze us. We still must act.
Moral residue, that makes sense. I like that term. If we're not mindful with how we balance the rights and obligations of society to the rights and obligations of an individual, if we don't balance that well, that can do more harm than good. And what we're seeing with these measures, because these measures are balanced more for the society than they are of the individual, we can see that the measures are causing far more harm than the good that they had initially intended.
Yeah, I think people have sometimes wanted to equate some of the measures used during the pandemic with seatbelts, that we obligate people to wear seatbelts and fine them if they don't. But with seatbelts, the primary benefit of wearing a seatbelt is to the person wearing the seatbelt. It's not really primarily to society.
Yes.
Although part of the rationale is that we will have fewer severe injuries that we have to take care of in a hospital if someone's wearing a seatbelt than if they're not. But the primary benefit is actually to the person wearing the seatbelt. When you put on a seatbelt, you can take it off. When you inject someone with a vaccine, you can't uninject it. A seatbelt does not fundamentally change your immune system. A vaccine does in an irreversible way. So we have to remember that when we obligate someone to behave a certain way, we have to make sure that obligation is made as safe as possible, it's as effective as it can be, and that we've required as little sacrifice or potential for harm as is possible. And obviously, the more severe the obligation, for example, taking an experimental vaccine using a brand new technology, should require a higher threshold of safety, etc., than for something like a seatbelt, which is much more innocuous. So we have to realize that the context matters. We can't equate an experimental vaccine with a seatbelt. And if we're going to impose more severe and stringent obligations to people, again, we have to ensure that there is an appeal process.
And I know that we're going to talk in depth about vaccines under the vaccine mandates that we'll discuss later on. But when we talk in terms of ethics, and we are sort of tying this to the Nuremberg Code and the fact that these vaccines are experimental, and again, I know that we'll cover that, it doesn't seem very ethical to me to unleash these onto the population if they're still in the experimental trials and people aren't readily consenting to it. And so it sort of ties it back into our conversation about the Nuremberg Code.
Well, it's so important to remember that any human intervention, because it's done by humans, is going to involve potential for risk and harm, because we are imperfect. Any intervention we have is not going to be perfect. We have to acknowledge right from the get-go, no matter how careful we are, there may still well be harm. And so during the pandemic, have we really acknowledged the fact, and we've spoken of this before, about potential harms from our mental health, for our freedom, for our financial situations, for our physical fitness, our obesity, for the treatment and investigation of other diseases, etc. Have we really monitored and considered the harms along those lines and many, many other harms? So some harms are going to be obviously worse for some people than others, and we need to be able to factor that in. With 7 billion people on the planet, the harms are not going to be identical for all of them. And if we care about the individual, if we believe that life is sacred, we need to factor that into our equations of what measures to enact.
You know, and hindsight is everything, and that's why we're sitting down here discussing this 20-some months after the pandemic was declared. And I wonder if people, you know, that expression, if we knew now what we knew then, or if I've said that right, I wonder if we knew 20 months ago what the measures would actually involve, if we would readily accept them.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that the measures have been slowly ramped up over time, and so it's sometimes hard to stand back and look at the big picture and see where we've come to from where we came from. And I think if we did, we might have a different view of things. You
know, we have a small section on our website, and we say, how do you boil a frog? It's how, you know, that's that old analogy. Well, you put a frog in a pot of cold water and you turn up the heat slowly, and so, you know, the frog doesn't notice that the hot water is boiling until it's too late. And so these measures have been sort of slowly, and, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 1 step back, you know, and before you know it, we are in a bit of a totalitarian society without even realizing that this is still Canada.
And that's why I'm hoping that ethics will come to the fore, because ethics demands that we stand back and take a big picture view of things and be open-minded to things and reevaluate, because ethics really requires us to reevaluate on a regular basis, to never be satisfied that we've finally got the best answer, that we're always searching for a better answer and a better answer, which is really what science is about as well.
You know, I'm so enjoying this conversation, and I've said it from the beginning that ethics is a missing component here. It's been missing, and I don't think that anybody else is having these conversations that we are. So let's wrap this up for now. Continue it again, unless there's something else you want to share.
No, that's great, and we'll finish off in our next video.
That's great. Okay, well, thanks so much again, Barry.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you, everyone.